All right, so we are here at our first official Blab session. This is Professor Derek Weber being very formal for our review session on membranes and transport. Here's how it's going to work. We can see your chat on the side. I can see you as you come in. If you have questions, feel free to take a seat. Let's talk about the issues that you have. Everyone can hear us. This way we can communicate a little more synchronously than we could with the just audio podcast. And so we'll spend about 45 minutes walking through, if we need it, about your questions. Hopefully we can get things answered. What I'd love to do in the future is have other people sit down and help answer the questions. So I'd love to have a co-host. So ideally what'll happen if someone sits down and asks a question, you could certainly raise your hand, take a seat, and you could help answer it, and I'll make sure to clean up any loose ends. So is that clear for everybody what we hope to do here in this session and in future sessions? Great. And what I'd really like to have happen, if someone sits down and acts as a co-host and answers some questions, to have the people in the audience give them some props so we know if they're doing a good job. Maybe I could tie in some extra credit points for those that participate as a co-host based on the number of DAPs they get. All right? So who wants to be first today? Who wants to ask the first question? Oh, somebody's got to be the first. Because it's not a good review session if no one asks questions, because that means you understand everything already. All right, Michelle, you think of one, and then you take a seat. Because I think there's some complicated issues in this chapter. When we talk about secondary active transport, the reshaping of cell membranes, the idea of entropy in relation to diffusion. There we go. Michelle, the problem with your picture is I don't know if you're Plak or you, but it's you. Okay. So thank you for being the first one. Someone's always got to be the first one, so I appreciate it. So let's hear your volume.
You're welcome.
Levels. Can you speak a little bit for
my
me?
volume levels?
Yeah, I want to make sure I could hear you.
I'm speaking.
Okay, can everyone hear? All right. Excellent. So, Michelle, what question do you have today as the first Blab session?
My question is, how do channel proteins differ from carrier proteins?
Oh, that's a really good question. So does anyone want to volunteer to answer that? Go ahead. Whoever steps up first. All right. Sarah's going to tackle this one, Michelle. All right.
Okay.
All right, Sarah. Thank you. And tell your parents they have lovely taste in wallpaper.
Hey, Michelle. So
Hi, Sarah.
channel proteins are literally what it sounds like a channel. And some of them are gated and some are non-gated. So the non-gated ones, like things can just go through them whenever they want, whatever they're feeling. And then the gated ones, like they'll be closed sometimes and they'll be open other times. But like a molecule has to bind to the channel protein for the gate to open, and then things can go in. And things can go in like really, really fast. Like really, a lot of things can go in really, really fast. But then carrier proteins, it takes like more time, and like it's like it has a specific shape, and then when something comes in to go into the cell and binds to it, that can change the shape of the carrier protein, and then like instead of it being closed to the inside, it'll be closed to the outside and open to the inside, and it can move into the cell. Mm-hmm. Or something like other than the thing trying to move in or out of the cell can bind to the carrier protein and make it open and make it like switch sides.
So I'm going to interrupt real quick. So you're doing a great job. I want you to get things out of your vocabulary, though. So Instead of things, can we think of other words to describe what's moving there?
Solutes.
Solute is a great one. So now you said some interesting things. So I'm going to now ask both of you, and Michelle, jump in if you still have some misconceptions or things that are not clear. So you talked about a channel protein either being always open, where things can move in either direction, right? Now, when they move, in what direction do they move based on the gradient? Can I ask you guys that question? When things move through a channel protein, in which direction do they move in relation to the gradient?
High to low.
High to low, right?
Yeah.
So they're always moving from areas where there's high populations, areas of low population, right? So what kind of transport would be represented by movement of high to low through a channel protein? What kind of transport would that be?
Passive.
It is passive. Can you give me a specific type of passive transport that's represented by that? Michelle, do you know what type of passive transport uses a protein to take things from high to low?
I don't know.
Do you know that one, Sarah? Does anyone in the audience know that one? So what type of transport uses a protein to take solutes from high to low concentration? There it is. Kushma got it. Facilitated diffusion, right?
Thanks,
In this case, we have a protein that facilitates the movement because the solute's character doesn't allow it to get across a phospholipid bilayer.
What's that?
Who's shameless
So
plug?
I'm so happy. Thank you for joining. This is a shame. We got a shameless plug. See, I once you're out there, these sessions are open, so we just realized that can sometimes happen. All right. I got to figure out how to block them, Mayor. I agree with you, because if I knew how to block, you'd also be blocked. No, I'm just kidding. But so when we talk about, I'm just kidding. So when we talk about diffusion, right, not all solutes can move through that hydrophobic core, right? Ions, polar molecules, large molecules require a protein, right? And so facilitated diffusion, facilitate means to assist. And so a channel is a great example of facilitated diffusion. Now you talked about a gated channel, and I want to talk a little bit more about that, Sarah. So a gated channel, how do you open the gate? What are some examples, specific examples of channels that are stimuli that would open or close a gate? You know any examples? Maybe from A and P?
I remember it, but I can't.
Yeah, I remember talking about that, but I don't know what they're called.
Does anyone know? Does anyone want to take a seat? Does anyone know any specific kind of channels from A and P, often involved in action potential? So sodium potassium is an example of a not a channel, but in that case that's a pump. Not aquapores. How about a voltage-gated ion channel? Do you guys remember hearing about voltage-gated ion channels by chance? Did you guys not talk about that in A&P? Oh, good. So the way that works is you guys talked about voltages across a nerve cell. So a resting nerve cell normally has what kind of charge? Does anyone know? Either who's sitting down or in the chat. At resting, what's the resting potential of a nerve cell? We're going to have to talk to your A&P teacher here. How about negative 70 millivolts? Right? Oh, here, I'm going to try something crazy here. I'm going to draw something. And then I'm going to hold it up to my camera. See how that works. All right. So you have action potentials, right? We often use a graph for this. So negative 70 millivolts.
Kushma seems to think we learned it.
All right. It's totally backwards because the camera inverts images. Good for me. All right. So anyway, so the resting potential is at negative 70 millivolts. You did learn this. I know you learned. And so what begins to happen is channels can open at one end of the neuron. And what happens is sodium rushes in, right? So let's think about this. When sodium rushes into the cell, what happens at negative 70 millivolts? Yeah, you could do this in... Go ahead.
It gets less negative.
Less negative, right? Or more positive, right? You can look at it either way. And so that's what the action potential is, right? So as it gets more positive, it goes up to plus 20 millivolts. So now what happens is, remember we had Schwann cells, which I love saying Schwann cells. Remember those Schwann cells where the action potential would sort of jump down? So what would happen is, like a neurotransmitter combined, and we'll talk about that in a second, cause this part of the neuron to get excited, right, to go more positive. And then that would be sensed by another channel, right? And then this channel would open due to voltage differences. And when that channel opens, now sodium rushes in that part, and it sort of jumps down. So changes in ion concentrations can cause the gate to open. That's a voltage-gated ion channel. We also have a second type, and I'm going to type it in here so everyone has the name of this. We have a ligand-gated channel. And what happens in a ligand-gated channel, a neurotransmitter, for example, can be received by a muscle cell. And when the muscle cell receives that neurotransmitter, it causes the protein to open up, the gate to open, also allowing then for an influx. I saw someone behind you there, Michelle, allowing for an influx of ions into a cell. And so the gates can open.
I'm at Barnes & Noble.
Oh, very good. So the gates can open in response to a stimulus, whether it be a voltage, whether it be a ligand, but there's something that causes it to open. And so those are much more regulated than a channel that's always open. Correct? For a channel that's always open, all you need is a gradient and things are going to move in either direction. That makes some sense to everybody for those gated the channels? So it's facilitated diffusion. They could be open all the time or gated, and a stimulus can open those gates. So now let's get into the carrier proteins, which you did a nice job with, Sarah. So are the carrier proteins always open to both sides? No, they're only open to one side, correct? So now, Michelle, I'm going to ask you a little bit about what you know about carrier proteins here. So let's say I have a carrier protein that's open to the cytoplasm. Okay? So I often use my hands to sort of demonstrate this. So here's the sort of the shape of the carrier protein. Here's the cytoplasm on the inside. Here's the extracellular side. So what happens to that protein when the solute it recognizes binds into that binding pocket? Do you know, Michelle?
It like, if it binds here, then it like opens like this, and then it comes out this way.
You got it, right? So there's a lot that goes into that. So I think Sarah did a nice job talking about rate of transport. One great thing about proteins is they're flexible, right? We know they're not locked in with covalent bonds. We know they're weak bonds, so they can be reshaped when you add things to them. And so the thing about carrier proteins is they're very selective. Like a channel protein's not selective. All it needs is a gradient. I don't care if you're sodium, chloride, calcium. The solute doesn't matter. All that matters is, are you high? Are you low? I'm coming through, right? Because it's open on both sides. But a carrier is much more specific, right? So it's specific for individual solutes. And so if it's a sodium carrier, sodium needs to bind to open it up and allow sodium to flow. And so I think that's a big difference between a channel protein and a carrier protein is specificity. Did I answer your question there, Michelle? And did Sarah?
Yeah, definitely.
Sarah, you did a very nice job there.
Thanks, Sarah.
I'm gonna give you another one. You got 13 props. You got 15. Very nicely done. And Michelle, I'm going to give you one for sitting down and being the first to ask a question. All right. All right. So do you have any other questions, Michelle, or you want to take a seat on the side and come back later?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Sign language. Good. All right. So I'm going to kick you out in a very nice way. So now you're up in the question seat, Sarah. Do you have any questions, or do you want to go take a seat?
I have a really simple question.
Okay.
The book called Fatty Acid Tails, Fatty Acyl Tails, that's the same, right?
Yeah, so the acyl group is when it's attached to the glycerol. So a fatty acid has the carboxyl group and then the hydrocarbon. So by itself, it's a fatty acid. But when I take a 3-carbon glycerol and I attach a fatty acid to each, there's an acyl bond that allows it to stick to that sugar. And so that's why they're called fatty acyl tails, because a phospholipid would have 2 of those. That's a good question. Okay. Any other questions that you have? All right, so you could take a seat on the side. And then let's see. Next up, who's next? All right, somebody's got to be next here. I'll give some extra credit to those who ask questions and those who answer, so you can maybe be motivated here. All right, there we go. Thank you. There you go. I can see you.
Okay. So I'm looking at the book right now, and
but just speak up a little bit.
Sorry,
speak up a little bit.
It's talking about the synthesis of the membrane phospholipids in the ER. I'm just a little bit confused on how that works because I'm trying to read up on it, but I'm not sure what the actual steps are.
Okay.
Can you explain that real quick?
I can. So let's see. Is there anyone who wants to sit down and help me walk through this for some extra credit points? Don't all try to sit down at once. All right. All right. So I'll tackle this one since I have no other takers. So there's two ways to look at this process. We have a more global view of this, and then you get into the mechanistic details, which the book often does. I'm going to start with a big picture view of this because I'm not as interested on some of the mechanistic details. Okay, so let's just start big picture. And let's start with the rough ER because the rough ER is actually where the phospholipids for the cell membrane originate. So I think that's an important point to make, is that the rough ER, the phospholipids of the rough ER, are eventually used to build up the plasma membrane. So we have to understand that these membranes are dynamic. The rough ER is dynamic. It's constantly being built up and broken down. And the plasma membrane is dynamic. It's also being built up and broken down. All right, so we'll start there. So what's the core function of the rough ER, if I were to ask you? Now, is Ashi?
Aishu.
Aishu. Okay, I'm sorry, Aishu. I'm still working on these things. So Aishu, what's the main function of the rough ER that we learned about?
I'm sorry, my phone kind of froze for a second. What'd you ask?
So just speak up. Do you remember the function of the rough ER?
To help synthesize proteins.
Synthesize proteins. Now, all proteins for the cell or very specific types of proteins?
The ones that I can remember is the ones that with the ribosomes, which would be the co-translational and post-translational proteins.
So certainly the co-translational proteins specifically. So those examples of co-translational proteins would be secreted proteins, right? Proteins that end up outside the cell. Another example would be proteins embedded in the plasma membrane, so membrane proteins. The other one would be the proteins for the lysosome, right? Those originate in the rough ER. So they're very specific types of proteins that originate there, right? That are synthesized there. So can you tell me a little bit how proteins get from the rough ER? And I'm going to ask somebody to sit down for this one. How do proteins get from the rough ER to the plasma membrane? Can someone sit down and help me out with this one? Kushma, I'm calling you out. All right, maybe I shouldn't call anyone out. All right, so, Kushma, please have a seat. I'll tell you the question once you sit down. There we go. Thank you. I think Kushma has an outstanding internet connection here. Oh, so phone. So that's interesting. So you run it from your phone? Okay. So this will be our first mobile experience. Everyone else is on their computer? Ashu, you're on your computer, right?
I'm on my phone.
Okay, so I can hear you? Okay, Kushma, if you want to, I was interested to see if it works on the phone. All right, so I'm going to pick it up here. So I'm going to ask you, Ashu, how does it get from the rough ER to the plasma membrane? Do you remember the pathway it takes? So vesicles, I think I heard you say vesicles, correct?
Through vesicles, I think. Slightly, can you repeat that?
So the question was, how do proteins get from the rough ER to their final destination? What pathway do they take? Oh, no. Our whole show is a disaster right now, yeah. And I appreciate the advice for those that are in the room with us from outside. That's really, Leslie, thank you for that. Don't worry about it. So when we take cargo from the rough ER, we use the endomembrane system, right? So the endomembrane system uses vesicles to connect distant compartments. So the protein's made in the rough ER. It leaves the rough ER in a vesicle, goes to the Golgi. In the Golgi, the protein gets modified, right? Sugars get added or modified there in the Golgi. And then in a vesicle from the transface, it leaves to go to its final destination. One of those destinations is the membrane. And so as the protein within its vesicle goes to the membrane, we know that that vesicle fuses, becomes one with. So here we have this continuous plasma membrane, right? The barrier of the cell. Here I have my vesicle. The vesicle is going to fuse, and it's going to become one with. And so anything in the lumen of the vesicle and the inside of that bubble is going to then be secreted from the cell. And any proteins in the membrane are then going to be inserted into the plasma membrane. And so I think the important concept here, when we talk about how the phospholipids of the rough ER build the plasma membrane, it's because the vesicle fuses with the plasma membrane, adding phospholipids to it.
Okay.
Now, Ashu, did you catch that? Were you able to catch that even though you weren't on camera? Were you able to hear some of that?
Okay. All right. That makes. Yeah, no, I got it. I was just really confused because the book went into a lot more detail.
Yes. So for us, I'm not going to ask you about flipase, which is the enzyme that actually flips phospholipids between there, or talk a little bit about where the phosphate groups come from. That level of detail you can wait to a later class. But what's important to me is we understand that the phospholipids of the plasma membrane originate from the rough ER. And it's through those vesicles which they ultimately arrive at the surface. Does that sound good, Ashu? All right, let's see who else we have here from class. I see Malak's here. Krishna's here. All right, Mayor. You're up, bud. Take a seat. All right. So as we're waiting for somebody to take a seat, I'm just going to go through a little bit of what I think are some important points that are easily missed. The first is the idea that the membranes are dynamic. Right? We just gave you an example of how the rough ER is used to build up the plasma membrane. And so the plasma membrane can be broken down through the process of endocytosis, right, which is cellular engulfment. So when there's something outside the cell, right, it can cause the membrane to invaginate and eventually bring it in. And so the plasma membrane's broken down a bit. But then as vesicles reach the surface, we talk about we're adding to. Now, not only is our membranes dynamic in that way, they're built up and broken down, but we could change the content of the plasma membrane to adjust to environmental conditions. And so one of the ways, Mayor, I'm going to have you sit down here in a second. All right. You could take a seat now. I'll ask you a question. So one of the things we have to understand is temperature has a real impact on the fluidity of a membrane. And so we know the warmer the temperature, the less organized a fluid gets. And so you have much more movement within the membrane, that side-to-side movement. As temperatures drop, as things get cooler, we slow down movement within the membrane. It becomes much more rigid. And so if I'm a living entity, like a bacterium, like a fish, like a plant, that's constantly facing changes in temperature due to changes in season, due to changes in location, then I have to adjust my plasma membrane. And so I'm going to ask Mayor some of these questions and see what he can come up with. All right, Mayor, are you on your phone or are you on your laptop? This is what happens when you have a live show. You have these awkward moments when things don't work. And so I appreciate everyone who's patient with these technical difficulties. All right. So while Mayor's trying to sit down, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this dynamic membrane. So we talked about temperature impacting fluidity of a membrane. So I want you to think of the membrane having the consistency of salad dressing. So salad dressing, we know, is a fairly viscous substance. It's not quite watery like water, but it's not solid like a solid fat would be, right? So it's somewhere in the middle. And so now let's think about this. If the membrane is facing cold temperatures, and now the membrane becomes too solidified, right? The membrane's not going to function properly. What can we do to counteract that solidifying of the membrane? Can anyone out either answer it in the chat or you can have a seat? I'm going to kick Mayor out here because he's on a slow connection. How can we, based on what we learned, how can we adjust the makeup of the membrane to counteract the lack of fluidity, right, due to cold temperatures? Thank you for all the technical support, by the way. This is only really our first Blab session. And so we're still trying to work out all the kinks. So Jonas, I appreciate that. So can anyone out there help me out? Any of my students in the audience, help me out with what we learned about if we want to combat the solidifying of a membrane. Okay, good. Thank you, Eshu. We have a membrane. Okay, Mayor's going to try to take a seat. So we have a membrane exposed to cold temperatures. And when we have cold temperatures, right, the fluidity of the membrane slows down. It becomes more solid. A solid membrane won't function. Things will not be able to move back and forth. Those proteins will not be able to transport properly if the membrane is solid. In fact, in cold temperatures, if the membrane solidifies too much, it can crack like ice. And we can imagine if your cell membrane is cracked, your cytoplasm spills out, and now the cell's no longer viable. And so if I'm facing cold temperatures, I need to change the chemical makeup of my membrane to counteract the cold temperatures. So the question I have for you out there is, how can I change the chemical makeup of a membrane so it can become more liquefied, so it won't be so organized at those cold temperatures? Does anyone have an answer for me? So Sarah, can you take a seat for me for a second? Thank you. So now that's an interesting point you're making. So you're talking about more double bonds. Can you explain to me where those double bonds would be and what effect they would have?
In the fatty acid tails of the membrane, because then they'd be like more unsaturated, and unsaturated things tend to be more liquid at room temperature than saturated things.
Now, could you explain, so when you add that double bond to the fatty acid, remember there are two, right? You call them unsaturated fatty acids. That's accurate. Could you tell me a little bit about the physical structure of the fatty acid when you add a double bond?
Like kinks them.
It kinks, right? At the site of the double bond, it causes a bend. Like your elbow is a good example. I'm not flexing. I'm just showing the bend there in the fatty acid tail. Now, is it going to be able to organize itself as easily and stack when it's bent?
No.
And so if it's not as organized, is that going to make the membrane more solid, or would it make it more liquefied?
More liquid.
You got it. Right? So that's a great answer. Hang in there. Don't leave yet. But so one of the answers to combat the solidifying of a membrane is add more double bonds to make more unsaturated fats, because those unsaturated fats can't stack, thereby counteracting those cold temperatures, right? Making the membrane less solid. So that's great. Sarah, you get a lot of props for that and some extra credit points. Okay, so Michelle has a question. Michelle, can I ask you to pop into the seat then and ask what you're confused about?
Why it would be liquidy when it was less king?
Just repeat that because you just came on. So just repeat your question.
Why would it be in a more liquid form if it was less kinked?
No, if it was more kinked.
So that.
Oh,
yeah,
okay,
yeah. So that's good. So the idea is we add kinks, we add double bonds to combat the solidifying. We don't want saturated fatty acids under those conditions. So that was good. Okay, so that we work that out. Now, Kushma.
Yeah.
See, is Kushma on a laptop now? Kushma, could you take a seat? Thank you. Kushma, we got to get you something better than an egg. And we're looking at a nice HP Media Smart webcam.
We could hear you though, Kush. Say something.
Yes.
Hi.
Great. So right now all we need is audio, so don't worry about the video.
I think this is the laptop that has a broken webcam. I don't know.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
That's okay. So we could hear you. So Sarah gave me one of the answers. We're talking about a cell, the impact of temperature on a cell membrane. And we talked about colder than optimal temperatures and how we have to synthesize membranes that have unsaturated fatty acids. So can I ask you, what else can we do to that membrane in order to combat the solidifying of that membrane? Is there anything else we could do to the fatty acids or other molecules in the membrane?
Could you increase the temperature? Is that an option?
So that's going to be difficult. We have an advantage. No, that's okay. Humans have an advantage because of homeostasis, right? So we have built-in systems to sort of maintain body temperature, right? So if it gets too cold, we can shiver, right, to raise our body temperatures. If our body temperatures get elevated, we can sweat. So certainly in humans, we can adjust the temperature. So that's actually a correct answer, right? So I'm going to give you some props for that.
Yay.
How about cholesterol? We learned about cholesterol in this chapter, if you recall.
Yeah.
Remember what kind of molecule is cholesterol? Let me ask you that.
Who, me or Sarah?
You're on the Kushma. I'm going to ask you a few questions here.
Oh, okay. I think it is a lipid.
It is a lipid. Now, does it look like a fatty acid?
No.
So what makes it unique in the lipid category?
It's attached to proteins on the plasma membrane.
Let's not get into where it's located. Just talk to me about the physical structure of cholesterol. How does it look different than fatty acids?
It has chains.
Doesn't have chains.
No.
Fat, right? Fats have 3 chains.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, do you remember?
Ring structures.
Oh, there it is. How many rings does it have? Do you
4.
recall?
Oh, I'm holding oh, sorry, you can't see me. 4.
4. That's you were holding it up.
Fingers.
All right, so there's 4 fused rings. Now, tell me a little bit about if I were to put those cholesterol molecules, which are somewhat bulky, right? Because they have those 4 rings. If I were to put them in the middle of those phospholipid fatty acid tails, what do you think that does to the organization?
It creates space in between them, and so that increases the fluidity.
There, that's it, right? So you perfectly said that. So if cholesterol fits in between the fatty acid tails, it creates space. And if you create space, then, as you said, it's less organized. And so if it's less organized, it's going to be more or less fluid. Kushma.
Yeah. It's going to be more fluid.
It's going to be more fluid, right? So we want to insert cholesterol into our membrane to combat those cold temperatures. Mm-hmm. So that's a great answer. Nice work.
Yay.
And this wasn't that painful, right?
No, it wasn't. Just the webcam part.
Oh, okay. So now let me ask you, both of you, one more question. All right? Because we're losing people from the class left and right. All right? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. So what about length of fatty acid tails? Right? So fatty acid tails can have a different number of carbons. Hey, there she is. All right. Kushma, that's great. Thank you. So now we know that fatty acid tails can vary in length, right? They're hydrocarbons. They can be 14 to 18 carbons in length. Now let's think about how the length impacts organization. Kushma, I'm going to ask you this question, all right? When I describe phospholipids in a membrane, how do we often describe the makeup of or the arrangement of those phospholipids? Do you know what word they use to describe that?
In a bilayer.
Bilayer, right? And so bi in that case means how many layers? Two. And tell me, you could use your hand here. Pretend there's a phospholipid, right? There you go. Throw up the deuces, right? So are the heads in the inside and tails the outside, or how are they arranged?
No, like this.
You got it, right? And so the length of those tails becomes important. What if we were to make really long tails, right? So they almost touched one another. Do you think that's going to increase or decrease fluidity?
Increase, because it increases the space between them.
If they're really long and they're almost touching one another?
No, if they're really long, then it would decrease the fluidity.
It would decrease, right? Because it's more organized. But my fingers don't do it well, right? But what if they're shorter?
That would increase fluidity.
Right, so now let's think about a fish in cold temperatures. Is it going to want to lengthen its fatty acid tails? Or is it going to want to shorten its fatty acid tails? Sarah, I'm going to ask you that question.
Shorten.
It's going to shorten them, right? Because now I want to combat that organization, the solidifying at cold temperatures. By shortening them, they're more fluid. So what can I do in a membrane to combat temperatures? What are the three things that we discussed today?
Shorten your fatty acid tails.
That's one. Kushma, give me the second one. What did we do to combat cold temperatures?
You could include cholesterol in the plasma membrane.
Include cholesterol. That's the second one. Did either of you remember the third one?
More double bonds.
More double bonds. Right? So I think that's part of the chapter that students often overlook that I think is so critical, is when a cell faces environmental changes, how can it be dynamic? How can it respond? A membrane's not a static structure. It's constantly being rebuilt, broken down, and we're changing the chemical makeup of that membrane. You guys did a great job with that. In front of an audience, that's no less. So that's great. Any other questions that you guys have?
Could we go in more detail on the secondary and primary active transport?
Absolutely. Now, Sarah.
Starts, I have to go though.
Okay, Sarah, you go. You did a great job. I'm going to give you some more props. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Bye.
You did a great job. Okay, bye-bye. All right. So, Ashu, if you want to sit down, you're more than welcome to take a seat. If not, so let's start with just active transport. Mm-hmm. If you were to describe active transport, what are some of the properties that allows a cell to use active transport?
There's energy, there's the addition of energy in order to move it.
And why do we need an input of energy to make active transport happen?
Because we're going against the concentration gradient, and so you need the input of potential energy.
So are solutes happy being packed into a compartment all with like charges? Like if I'm sodium, do I want to be hanging around other sodiums where there's many of me in that one place? No, right? They want to get out. Right? I often, you know what it's like? It's like a bull and you ever see bull riding? Yeah. Or I'll give you another analogy because I don't know if everyone watches that. When I used to clean my room, I would just stuff things in the closet, right? And that was me cleaning my room. And at some point, it got really hard to keep shoving things in. It took energy for me to keep the door closed, right? So active transport is much in the same. Like I'm trying to put solutes in a full closet. And so I need energy to do that. It's not natural. Which way do solutes want to move spontaneously? Do you recall? What's that?
High to low.
High to low, right? Down their gradient. Do I need energy to get things to move high to low?
No.
Right? That door swings open. All those toys and all my clothes fell out spontaneously. All right, so you have that. So now what's the difference between the two? In primary active transport, we use the energy of ATP directly. I don't know if you were here earlier, but we talked about carrier proteins. Were you here for that discussion?
I was.
Okay, so we talked about shape changes, right? Now, for a primary active transport, we use a pump. Now, a pump is a carrier protein, but what changes its shape is the addition of a phosphate group. So when a phosphate gets added, the shape changes. Now, do you know a good source of phosphates in a cell?
ATP.
ATP, right? And so what kind of, I'm going to ask you a real hard one here, okay? Do you know the type of chemical reaction I'm going to use to break the bond in ATP to transfer the phosphate? Go ahead.
Hydrolysis.
You're on fire right now, right? Hold on. I'm giving you more here. So it is hydrolysis. So now, they're very specific. So if it's a sodium pump, sodium binds, we add a phosphate, and now it changes shape, and sodium's shoved into an area of high concentration. Mm-hmm. Now, these carriers have phosphatase activity. Just hang with me. I know that's not a word we heard before, but anytime you hear ACE, A-S-E, that's an enzyme. So phosphatase would remove the phosphate. And so what would happen is the protein, which is open, would go back to the closed state. So can you see how the phosphate and hydrolysis of an ATP mediates that transport?
Yeah.
Okay. So now secondary active transport doesn't use ATP. Do you remember what it used by chance?
Didn't it use the potential energy when it moved from high to low?
Perfect, right? So gradients are inherently unstable, which is the definition of potential energy. So now if you think about it, the cell works hard to make a gradient. The cell spends a lot of ATP in active transport, primary active transport, to make a gradient, to pump all the sodiums out, for example, or to pump protons out. Now we're going to use it because energy is never created or destroyed, right? So if we're going to spend energy here, the cell is going to use it for something else. And so in this case, we have a similar type of protein, but now we have, let's say, a sodium coming back in, down its gradient, which binds in the pocket. Along with that is a glucose molecule. When those two bind, we have a conformation change. Now sodium goes high to low, but now the glucose goes low to high. And so in this case, secondary active transport doesn't use ATP directly. It uses the existing gradient. Did any ATP, though, get used in an earlier step?
When it was moving it from low to high, the solutes from low to high.
You got it. Right? So a cell spends money to make a gradient because in the absence of energy, all cells would be at equilibrium. Right? All the sodium would be at equilibrium, potassium. And do you know what you call a cell at equilibrium by chance?
Homeostatic?
It's actually not homeostatic, and that's a common thing we take. You know what it is? It's a dead cell. Because a cell at equilibrium is a dead cell that has no potential energy to harness. Right? Like an action potential would never work at equilibrium. Mm-hmm. It only works because we made the gradient. So homeostasis and equilibrium are not the same thing.
All right.
Right? Balance is not necessarily the same as equilibrium. So we use ATP, as you said, in establishing the gradient so we can use it for something else. And just one last thing, I hope, you know what makes sense, I hope makes sense, is if I'm a single cell bacterium and there's glucose, I want all of that glucose because I need it for later, right? Mm-hmm. If I were just to use diffusion, how much of that glucose would enter the cell?
Not as much.
Can you give me roughly a number or percentage?
I don't know, like 50%?
There it is. What does 50% represent?
Half.
Half, and that represents equilibrium, right? Mm-hmm. So if I use diffusion, by the time I get to 50-50, then for every one that moves in, one moves out. That's not good. So active transport allows me to overcome equilibrium. That makes sense. So now if I'm a bacterium, I get all the sugar in, so I can use it later on.
Okay.
Did I answer your question with primary and secondary active transport?
Yeah.
Okay. So you want to take a seat on the side? Do you have more questions?
I'm good. Thank you.
You're good? All right. Great job, Kushma. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. All right. So now there's a few of you left. Are there any other questions I can get to before we end today's Blab session? And thank you all for retweeting this and coming today. We appreciate it, giving advice. Ashu, you okay? Sure, Leslie. That'd be great. Ashu, okay, great. Thank you so much. I do appreciate you coming, Ashu. Let's see who else is here before we... Malak said she had to go. Ashu, that would be great. Okay. And maybe I can get some answers on the mobile and best things to do to optimize connections and those kinds of things. Krishna, I haven't heard. Krishna is okay? Okay. So if there's no other questions, you guys are free to go. I would love to start this. Okay, that's good to know. So you could hear it on mobile, but when you had to sit down, you were having issues? Okay. I'll try to find some more information on that to see if there's something we can do. So I really like the having the camera here rather than just the audio podcast we were doing, because you could talk with your hands and try to give some examples. Leslie, great. I was hoping for that. So hopefully if enough people like this, talk to your classmates about it. We can maybe make this our weekly chat session rather than doing just the audio podcast. So, we'll talk more in class. So get the homework done for tonight, and then we'll see you guys tomorrow. Okay? Oh, great. Ashu, thank you for that feedback. The only thing this was better? Okay, great. Well, spread the word. And you know what we can do? If you use a hashtag Ask Dr. Weber on our Twitter feed, I could even have questions ready to go so we can avoid some of that dead space where I'm trying to fill in. So we'll talk in class about how we can maybe use Twitter to help anticipate some of these questions and then have more of a two-way, invite you guys on and you can answer the questions that were posted there on Twitter. So I'll come up with some good ideas and maybe assign some extra credit points for participating. All right. Great. Thank you, Kushma. Now, Leslie, we can stay here and chat, or what's the easiest way for us to do this? Okay. Oh, wait, Ashu, you have a question? Go ahead. No problem, Ashu. That's correct. So a symporter not only requires two solutes, but they both move in the same physical direction. One from high to low, one from low to high. And an antiporter would be in different directions. So one goes low to high, maybe into the cell. That would force another solute out of the cell. That would be an antiporter. Be very careful. So the sodium-potassium pump, Ashu, is neither of those. Actually, the sodium-potassium pump is one way, two uniporters, if you will. So sodium's getting pushed out from low to high, and potassium's getting pushed in low to high. So be careful with the sodium-potassium pump. It's actually a uniporter with two different solutes moving. Does that make sense? Are you good on that? Great. Okay. Thank you, Ashu.
Hey, how's it going?
How are you today?
Good, good. I just wanted to quickly jump in. Sorry to interrupt. I'm one of the founders of Blab. I love seeing what you're doing here. I'm a bio major myself, so I wanted to jump in. Maybe give me a pop quiz. Let's see what I remember. It's been 5 years.
So we're doing membranes and transport.
Okay, I heard a little bit about the sodium potassium pump.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how water gets into and out of a cell.
Water flows via osmosis. It's going from high concentration to low concentration of water. Other way around.
Well, that was a trick question. That was dirty of me. I asked you a hard one. So water is always water. You can't dilute water, make it more, but the solutes impact it.
Right.
So it moves from areas of low solute to areas of high solute.
That's right.
So the water wants to dilute the area that has lots of salt or sugar, which are important for like the kidneys and those kinds of things.
And as you know, I'm drinking my water as we speak.
There we go.
I have a water tally throughout the day. I got 4 down.
So do you know that's a myth? The 8 glasses of water is actually not a real thing. It really is impacted, but it's good to do. I'm not saying it's not.
Right.
It really does depend though on the individual and their weight and their kidney function, all that kind of stuff.
Well, tell me if this is wrong. I heard that most of hunger is actually what we perceive as hunger is often thirst. And so every time I get hungry, I go drink water. It's working out pretty well so far.
And it also makes you feel full. That's a great approach. But you're looking fantastic there. I don't think you need to worry about that. All right, enough of the Cushing here. So listen, I just was made aware of this technology through another podcast that I listened to.
Which one is that?
Don't judge me. I like
them.
some reality shows.
And
so Rob has a website. So I listen to the Survivor ones.
Very cool.
And he just did a Blab recently, and I listened to the Big Brother one. My wife likes it. That's why I do it. But
hey, I still watch Survivor and Big Brother, and nobody else. I thought nobody else in the country does. So
other scientists would judge me harsh on that. But
so you're basically doing office hours, like virtual office hours right now?
This is it. So how can I engage students out of the 2 hours or 3 hours I get with them?
Sean, did you watch
so these are
what he was doing?
No, I just jumped in at the end. Sorry.
Oh man, it was great. I mean, the students were in here asking him questions. He was asking the students questions. It was awesome.
That's great.
Yeah. So here's a little bit about why what I was looking for, and I'll tell you where I've been and why I ended up here. These are actually 16-year-old students who are in college right now. So they get their associate's degree before they graduate high school. And so these are really talented kids, but they get bussed here twice a week. And when they get bussed here, they're busy all day. So in college, we have office hours. If you have questions, you show up at my office, but they're not on campus.
Right.
And they're 15, so they can't drive.
Right. They'd have to
I'm trying to figure out how can I connect with them outside of those 2 days. And so this was a really nice opportunity to have synchronous communication. Mm-hmm. Like I can't stand email because it takes you 48 hours to even get to the question because there's back and forth. And so having audio is really helpful. And so I tried podcasting with MixLR, just doing an audio podcast. And I have a Twitter feed just for our class where I use Twitter to communicate.
Right.
And so I was trying to use hashtags, and it was fun because I got to bring in some music that was in the public domain, but I got to be a little creative. But it was difficult just to talk into a microphone without any reaction. Like I can't see the students. I can't get those cues. And I like to talk with my hands, and it was going to no one.
Right.
And so this is where I think Blab really is nice because they can see me, but it's more than that. Then I can see them. And they could all be waiting in line. They could all be in the classroom on the side. If they have a question, sit down. And now we could have more of a conversation that's authentic, more of a classroom experience.
Were they?
And so here,
sorry, I was just going to ask, were they preferring to type it into the chat, or did they prefer to call in and just ask you?
I think they preferred to call in. Some of them said I didn't like to have to type it all out.
Cool.
They like the fact that they can step up. So here's my goal is I want to be a facilitator of learning. Like that's my overarching view of my role in the classroom. And so what I really want to have happen is have 2 seats for students who are going to be the educators, a seat open for the questioners, and me sort of guide it.
Yeah.
Fill in the gaps. I want them to create content. I don't want to always be the content creator.
Right. So you could do question and answer. Let's call that the barbaric way of doing this. But the kind of next level would be facilitating a conversation where we all learn a little bit together. We kind of go on that journey.
That's exactly it. That's exactly. And if someone in the crowd has an answer and they want to jump in, they can jump in.
Right.
And so really, we talk about learning communities, and I know that's a buzzword, but I really believe in that, where I don't need to be the expert. Man, the internet's a great place. They can get the content, but how do we synthesize? How do we make sense of it? That's really what I want to do. And it doesn't just have to be me. There's 25 talented kids in my class.
So
well, hey, that's really awesome.
I had a question to ask you. Is it something that you're trying to do pretty much exclusively for your class, or are you trying to also open it up for anyone that's interested in biology?
So if I'm a believer in learning communities, then it shouldn't be for those that paid to be in my classroom. Anybody. I really want it to be anybody. Now, we had someone come in and spam the heck out of our chat, and I wasn't quick enough to mute them. I'm still learning the ropes. Yeah. And so, of course, that's always a drawback.
Yeah,
but ultimately, I think it would be great to open it up to anybody, whether they're in college, not in college.
That's actually why I came on here, because I do I do some things on Blab, yes, but my bigger online property is actually a biology website.
Okay.
And it's called Interactive Biology.
Okay.
And what I do is I use when I was doing it, I used to be a professor teaching anatomy and physiology and pathophysiology and so on. But when I was actively doing it, I was creating videos kind of like the Khan Academy style, and I worked with Khan Academy for a little while. And I was putting those videos on YouTube and embedding them on my blog. But I haven't been touching that website over the last 4 years. When I started teaching as a professor, I kind of put that on the back burner. And I've been always wanting to continue adding content to it and providing value for this month, I'll probably get about 90,000 people at that website just using the video content that's on there. And I was actually interested in seeing if you're interested in doing either what you did or some other kind of content and collaborating in a way, because I don't have time to bring biology content to these people. And if you wanted to use that platform, it's a pretty big platform with a pretty solid email list and 87,000 YouTube subscribers and millions of views. If that's something you're interested, I was here fascinated by the content from the time I came in, because physiology and so on, this is stuff that I love, but I don't get to touch it. And my audience is waiting for more of that content, but I'm not giving it to them. So if it's something you're interested in talking a little more about, I'm definitely interested in something.
So I'm gonna follow you, and then maybe we can DM one another and talk a little bit about what you had in mind and those kinds of things.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't have anything very specific in mind as yet, but I think, the way you're teaching, the way you're interacting and engaging, the analogies that you're using, like how you stuffed all your laundry in your closet and the potential energy was building up and that kind of stuff. That's what I love, and that's what the internet, quite frankly, loves, because they go to their biology classes and their professors are boring and they have these textbooks that they can't understand. But the way you did it, oh man, it was powerful, man. And I think
that's really nice of you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So if you're interested in connecting on that, I'm interested in exploring that, because it's a lot of people that use interactive biology that would love to engage with you on this platform if you want.
Okay.
And engage in other ways that we can talk about.
Okay. That sounds good. So I'll follow you, and then maybe we could do a follow-up
awesome. Yeah, let me make sure that I'm connected with you on Twitter and all that good stuff.
Cool. Well, sorry we hijacked you here. I just wanted to say hello, and let me know if you ever have any questions or need anything from us. But I love the way you use this tool here. This is really cool, and I hope it continues.
Well, can I just ask you a quick question while you're on that?
Yeah, please do.
Some of the students appeared when they were on their mobile have issues taking a seat, and I don't know if that's just their cellular network issue. Do you find that to be an issue with the mobile app?
So we had a bug over the weekend, so we are working on that for mobile, just to make sure that people who are on their iPhone can jump in seamlessly. It's working a lot better now. So I'm surprised you had the issue today. It is largely dependent on your connection. So like if you're somewhere where you don't have strong connection, you're getting multiple video feeds. So it's not it's not as lightweight as we want it to be, and as we will optimize it to be. But yeah, I think that in general, you should have no problem calling in from your phone. It happens thousands of times a day. I hope it was just kind of a couple of one-off cases that you hit today.
But what you're referring to on the app? Because if they are on the browser, right. Depending on whether they're using the app or the browser, I think have there been issues with the browser accessing the camera via Blab on the mobile device, Sean?
No, you can't do it from the browser on mobile. You either have the app on mobile, or if you're on your computer, you use your browser. Unless you have Android. If you're on Android, you'll use the Chrome browser on your phone.
And I suspected that some of them were actually trying to use the browser to come on via video. So that might be it.
Did you see them calling in and pulsing, or was it just in the chat that they said, "Hey, I can't get in"?
You saw
pulsing.
So if they're pulsing, that means that they're in the app and they're trying to call in. It's just must not have worked for one random reason. In general, there's really only two like tips for Blab. One is have good Wi-Fi, and then the second one is if you ever have a problem, literally if you just exit Chrome and come back in, that usually clears it up, because what happens is people leave their browser open for days on end, and they there's a memory problem where they have so many tabs open, or it's just been open for so long that they've never closed and reopened it.
Okay, and one of the students who's still here says the audio video worked for a while before it froze on the app on the phone, and one other student. So I could debrief them tomorrow and get more specifics, and let you know if there's any common themes that.
Please do. Please do.
Okay. Well, guys, thank you for stopping in and for the help during the session. I appreciate it. Hope to see you on here soon. All right, Leslie. Well, I'll be in touch.
Yeah, and make sure if you follow me on Twitter. Because that'll be an easier way for us to connect, because you can't DM on this platform. So
no, that's what I was going to do. Okay. Yeah, for sure.
Awesome, right. Man. Great job, man. I'm excited about what you're doing, because I think it's great to have biology professors using these kinds of platforms. So keep it up, man.
Hey, I appreciate all the kind words. You're really too kind. I appreciate it.
Awesome.
Have a great night, okay?
Take care.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.